speaking of geopolitical bias, possibly. So Null Report says here, the president of Brazil offers to discuss, quote, the Crimean issue to end the war. Quote, and this is what Null Report says, perhaps it makes sense to discuss Crimea. And then Zelensky cannot want everything either. We have to come to a decision, said Lula da Silva in an interview with Figaro. Did someone ask this guy? Now, the way this is reported makes it sound like that Lula says that Crimea should be like on the table for discussing and that Zelensky should be ready to give up Crimea. But that's not actually what he said. And so you have to be really careful here. Now, is this because I'm more likely to support Lula than Bolsonaro? I'm not a Bolsonaro fan, and he was an authoritarian, terrible leader, very much like Putin, which is why he's a good mate of Putin. Lula, I don't think is such a mate of Putin, like although they have had previous, but I think that's cooled since then. So when you start then seeing a reaction to this tweet by No Reports with a whole load of people piling in against Lula and Brazil, saying this is absolutely freaking terrible, etc., it's worth finding out what was actually said. So this Brazilian says, well, this is, then pastes in what was actually said. So Lula says Putin cannot keep the land. So Lula says Putin cannot keep the land invaded in Ukraine at breakfast with journalists. The president again defended that a group of countries negotiate peace with Russia and Ukraine. Lula said he did not agree with the Russian invasion. And this is this piece by a couple of Brazilian journalists. De Silva said this Thursday, the 6th, that Russia cannot stay with the invaded territory in Ukraine, and again defended negotiation between countries for the conflict to be ended. Russian troops invaded Ukraine in February last year, and since then fighting has continued in the region, blah, 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 blah. And it goes on to say, 1 year of war in Ukraine, understand the 4 phases of the conflict. For Lula, it is necessary to bring countries together to negotiate peace with the presence of Russia, Vladimir Putin, and Ukraine, Zelensky. The president also defends that the territorial integrity of the countries must be maintained. Quote, it is not necessary to have a war. Oh, what does Putin want? Putin cannot keep the land in Ukraine. Maybe Ukraine will not be discussed, but what he invaded again will have to be rethought, right? So there's a lot of wriggle room about what exactly he's talking about here, said Lula during coffee with journalists. Quote, Zelensky cannot have everything he thinks he wants either, which is different to what he said. Zelensky cannot want everything either. That doesn't even make sense. You can't tell someone they can't want everything. I can want the moon on a stick, right? Doesn't mean I'm going to get it, but you can't tell me what I want, right? So the actual translation, or possibly a better translation here, is that it is where was it? Zelensky cannot have everything he thinks he wants either. Now, is this hyperrealism? Or is this Russian appeasement? NATO will not be able to install itself on the border. No, it won't until long after this is ended. So that's true. All of this is a matter that we have to put on the table. So I think this is basically more nuanced, and doing this kind of just looking at that. And I know I do this an awful lot with taking most of my sources from Twitter, but we must be careful not to misinterpret what's actually gone on here. And I really should go back to the original article itself rather than another person on Twitter arguing back there. But it's really interesting. Thanks for the full picture. Lula's quote was obviously taken out of context. People who hate Lula have jumped on this, and there have been loads of Brazilians that jumped on this saying, yeah, I'm really sorry for Lula, he's terrible, and I apologize that the world has to listen to Lula. You're obviously clearly pro-Bolsonaro, and that's why you're saying that. So, we need to be really careful as we navigate the information space ourselves.